This reading, which is our longest one, comes again from the book Bach, Beethoven, and the Boys, Music History as It Ought to Be Taught. And this is your larger, thicker packet, okay? If anyone had known that Handel was going to grow up to become such a great composer, maybe we would know much more about his early life, but nobody was paying much attention at the time. George Friedrich Handel was born in 1685 in the little town of Halle in Saxon, Germany. If you go to Halle today, you'll see a house with a sign that says Handel's birthplace. He was born in the house next door. Handel's grandfather, Valentin Handel, had moved to Halle about 1600 and became the town's official bread weigher. His father, Georg, who was 62 when the boy was born, was a prominent barber and surgeon. You know, a barber is somebody who cuts hair, right? That's a useful combination of trades, although customers had to be careful when they asked Georg to take a little off the top and sides. But at least if he cut you shaving, he knew how to stitch you back up again. He once removed part of a knife blade from a boy who swallowed it a year and a half earlier. Georg just looped a string around it and pulled. The boy came to be known as Rudolph the Sword Swallower. Handel's father had no interest in music, so he thought his son shouldn't either. He wanted his son to become a lawyer and make something more of himself. Handel's mother, Dorothea, was more tolerant, and the story goes that she smuggled a small, quiet keyboard instrument called a clavichord into the house so the boy could practice late at night in the attic while his father was asleep. The story sounds too good to be true, if you ask me. Handel probably made it up. One day, when he was about 9, Handel went with his father to the palace of the Duke, who wanted more curls and a little trim at the back, so he was there to cut the Duke's hair. While Handel's father was busy snipping, the boy wandered into a chapel where there was an organ. Forgetting his manners, he started to play some of the music he'd been practicing in the attic. Fortunately, the Duke was not angry and made Handel's father promise to give the boy music lessons, so he studied organ with a man named Zachau. And then there's a cute little illustration of Handel practicing up in the attic at night with his little clavichord. Handel enrolled at the University of Halle at 17 to study law. His father had died earlier that year, but he went ahead with law anyway, even though his heart wasn't in it. He preferred concertos to codicils any old day. Still, it was a thoughtful gesture for the old man. Pretty soon, however, Handel jumped at the chance to become an organist at the Halle Cathedral, and he left school. He had already filled in many times before for the regular organist, who often arrived too drunk to play. And that's not good, because isn't it usually church in the morning? Not that you should be drunk any time, but yikes. Anyway, we've heard lots of stories about that. By 1703, Handel had left Halle for the big city of Hamburg, where he supported himself teaching private students and playing second violin in the Opera House Orchestra. He became friends with Johann Mattheson, and the two traveled to Lübeck to meet the great Danish organist Dietrich Buxtehude. Do you remember that name from our last reading? He offered them each his job in return for marrying his daughter. They said they'd think about it and left town in a hurry. I don't know what was wrong with Buxtehude's daughter, but remember Bach did pretty much the same thing? Handel and Mattheson also got into a big quarrel once, which they settled by having a rapier duel. It's like a sword fighting, right? It might have been serious when Handel was stabbed, but Mattheson's sword was stopped by a button on Handel's coat. After that, they made up and were friends again, although Handel probably took to wearing coats with extra large buttons all over. Handel's first two operas were produced in Hamburg and were a moderate success, but Handel knew that if he wanted to make it big time in opera, Italy was where it's at. He went there in 1706, although it's not at all clear where he got the money to afford it. Handel spent most of 1707 in Rome, even though there wasn't any opera going on. The Pope had banned opera as being offensive and sacrilegious. Remember we talked about that a little bit with Vivaldi and how he had trouble in Italy? Even though there was no opera, Handel had a good time anyway, with lots of parties and musical events. He met many important Italian composers of the day, such as Arcangelo Corelli and the Scarlattis, Alessandro and his son Domenico. Handel and the younger Scarlatti had a little contest to see who was the better player. Scarlatti beat him at the harpsichord, but Handel cleaned up on the organ, so it worked out to a tie. Handel played tourist for a while and went off to Venice. In 1709, his opera Agrippina was performed there. The audience loved it so much that they began shouting, "Viva il caro Sassone," which means "Long live the beloved Saxon." That's Handel they're talking about. Handel was in, and he knew it. All told, Handel spent about 3 years in Italy. In addition to the operas, he wrote about 100 cantatas and some church music, and had a good time. In 1710, Handel accepted a job as Kapellmeister to the Elector of Hanover. He got the job only because he knew someone who knew someone. He had only been there for a few months when he asked for some time off to go to London. On his way, he passed through Halle and said hi to his mom, who told him to pack clean socks and write home when he got the chance. Handel was an even bigger hit in England than he'd been in Italy. Londoners accepted him with great enthusiasm. They hadn't had any composer to get really excited about since the death of Purcell back in 1695, so Handel came along at just the right time. He composed the opera Rinaldo for his first London visit, and the crowds loved it. Whole chunks of Rinaldo are made up of music Handel took from his earlier opera Agrippina and some other oratorios, but the audience didn't know that, and Handel wasn't about to tell them. One of the highlights of Rinaldo is his use of recorders to represent singing birds. Did you guys learn to play the recorder in 4th grade? Yeah, it wasn't always a great experience. I teach it to my 4th graders now, and it's still not always a great experience. Anyway, in case that didn't get the point across, at every performance there were a few live sparrows released on stage. This sort of thing is all right as long as it doesn't get out of hand. Eventually, Handel realized that he better keep his promise to return to his job in Hanover, although he didn't want to. Compared with life in London, life at the court of Hanover was dull. Within a year, he had convinced the elector to let him visit London again, promising to return in a reasonable time. His first London visit had lasted 7 months. This next lasted nearly 50 years. Handel composed a couple of operas for the 1712 season and also a birthday ode for Queen Anne, his first setting of English words. He hadn't quite got the hang of the language, but he was keen to work on it. In 1713, Owen McSwiney, what a name, manager of the Haymarket Theatre, skipped town with all the money from Handel's opera Teseo. It put a strain on their relationship. In 1714, Queen Anne died, and Handel's boss, the Elector of Hanover, surprise, surprise, became King George I of England. He couldn't speak a word of English, but that didn't seem to bother anybody, least of all George. He never knew what anyone was talking about, but that didn't seem to be a requirement of the job. A lot of people seem to think that George was angry at Handel for having run off on him. You know how he spent all that time in London. And the story goes that Handel composed the orchestral suite known as the Water Music to get back on George's good side. George wasn't angry at all. One of the first things he did when he arrived was to give Handel a raise. The king also went to a performance of Handel's opera Rinaldo. He was supposed to be in disguise, but he brought along his favorite mistress, and they chattered in German throughout the whole performance, so everyone knew who it was. There was no doubt that George enjoyed the Water Music, which Handel composed for a special royal outing on the Thames, and that's a river that goes right through London. The king and his friends floated down the river eating and drinking, while Handel and 50 musicians floated beside them on another barge playing dance music. The king liked the music so much that he had it played 3 times. It was a huge success, even though the players got a little wet. Handel moved to Middlesex for a while as a house guest of James Bridges, the Duke of Chandos. Chandos had been paymaster to Queen Anne's army during the War of the Spanish Succession and somehow came out of it a whole lot richer than he went in. And we've talked a lot about those wars and how it was all about money. You watched those crash courses, so you know. He spent a fortune building a big house called Cannons, which had plenty of guest rooms. Handel composed the 11 church anthems now known as the Chandos anthems while he was there. And, quick fact, I have sung them, and they're really good, and they're really fun, and they're in English, which is great. One story tells us that during a thunderstorm, Handel took refuge in a village blacksmith shop, and then composed a set of variations on a tune he heard the harmonious blacksmith whistling. You can believe it if you like. In 1719, a group of noblemen set up the Royal Academy of Music and asked Handel to be the music director. They wanted to produce great operas, so Handel went off to Europe to hire singers. Handel dropped into Halle to see his mother. Hearing he was in town, Bach walked the 20 miles from Leipzig to meet him, but by the time Bach arrived, Handel had just left. Darn. Opera in the 18th century was quite different from nowadays. Back then, the audience didn't even pretend to be listening to the music. They went to socialize, play cards, eat, and flirt with whoever caught their fancy. The singers didn't help matters. They would bring their favorite arias, or those are songs, with them and insert them into the action, even if the aria was from a different opera. The leading female role, called a prima donna, was usually a soprano. The leading male was usually a castrato from Italy, where they specialize in that sort of operation and have sharper knives. I don't want to get into what all that means, but it makes him sing really high. He was called a primo uomo. The music, tenors were rarely used and never for important parts. The music consisted of mostly arias, about 30 of them, in the da capo form with a built-in repeat. It was like having a guaranteed encore. They just kept singing it over and over and over again. But it didn't really matter because no one was paying attention anyway. The Royal Academy opened in 1720, and Handel set to work composing one opera after another. Audiences created a bit of a rivalry between Handel and another composer, Bononcini, but it was nothing compared to the rivalry over the two main sopranos, Cuzzoni and Faustina. Handel had brought Cuzzoni from Italy. She was a bit moody, but had a lovely voice. Horace Walpole describes her as short and squat. I hope nobody ever calls me that. That's not how I want to be in the history books. Yikes. When she disagreed with the way Handel wanted her to sing an aria, he held her out the window until she saw things his way. Handel was always having trouble with singers. When a Scottish tenor named Alexander Gordon threatened to jump on Handel's harpsichord, the composer said, "Tell me when, and I will advertise. More people will come to see you jump than hear you sing." That shut him up. In order to draw larger crowds, the Academy imported another soprano named Faustina. Her rivalry with Cuzzoni went to absurd lengths. For one opera, Handel had to compose 2 arias, one for each of them, with an equal number of notes so that neither singer would feel cheated. The rivalry came to a head in 1727 during the performance of Bononcini's opera Astianato. Different factions of the audience hissed and cheered for the favorite 2 singers. The audience got so heated that a fight broke out, followed by one on stage with the 2 sopranos going at each other tooth and nail. Some people take their entertainment very seriously. That same year, George I died from eating too many melons, and was succeeded by his son, George II. Now, this is important. For his coronation, Handel composed the anthem Zadok the Priest, which has been sung at every coronation since. And that's true, even like modern day Zadok the Priest. I have sung it before, not at a coronation, but just because it's a super famous song to sing. And I will put a recording of Zadok the Priest in your form so that you have a chance to listen to it. But George II got to hear it first. In 1729, Handel made another trip to Italy to find good singers and came back with a soprano named Anna Maria Strada de Po. She remained loyal to him even when business was bad and all of his other opera singers deserted him for a rival opera company, the Opera of the Nobility. There's been some speculation that Handel and Strada might have been having an affair, but I find no evidence to support this theory. In fact, not much is known about Handel's love life. He never married, although he did seem to have an eye for the ladies. There was one he toured Europe with as a young man, but I forget her name. Historian Stanley Sadie puts it this way: a composer who could depict women in his music as vividly as Handel does is unlikely to have been entirely ignorant of them in real life. Well, that's tactful. At some point in any discussion of Handel, his oratorio, Messiah, is bound to come up. Oratorio was a useful escape from... I lost my spot. I got it back. Oratorio was a useful escape for Handel from the problems associated with opera. In many ways, the music is the same, but without all the trouble of scenery and costumes and movement. On the whole, oratorio is a lot cheaper to produce than opera, which must have appealed to Handel's strong business sense. Handel composed Messiah in just under 3 weeks. That's fast, but nowhere close to the record, even for him. The libretto, that's like the words to it, was compiled by Charles Jennens, who was a good librettist, but an extravagant fop. He had one servant whose job it was to pick up the oyster shells that Jennens discarded after him everywhere he went. That's a strange kind of litter. On his way to the Dublin premiere of Messiah, Handel stopped off in Chester and assembled a bunch of singers to run through some of his new choruses. One of the basses, a printer named Jansen, made so many mistakes that Handel raged at him. "I thought you could read music at sight." "Yes, sir, and so I can," Jansen replied, but not at first sight. Messiah was first performed in 1742, with 700 people packed into a theater designed to hold 600. Guess there wasn't COVID back then. In the advertisements, ladies were asked to wear skirts without hoops, and gentlemen were asked to leave their swords at home to make more room. It was a huge success, and later caught on in London, where Handel used it to close the season with a bang each year. Handel, of course, was something of an expert on big, showy music. He once told the composer Gluck, "What the English like is something they can beat time to, something that hits them straight in the eardrum." As anyone will tell you, the king was so moved by the first London performance of the Hallelujah Chorus that he stood up, thereby establishing a silly tradition that continues to this day. Personally, I think his foot had gone to sleep. You might call it the musical version of the 7th inning stretch, but this is the truth. If you ever go to see the Messiah, or if you're ever in a place where the Messiah is performed and they get to the Hallelujah Chorus, that is the tradition. Everyone in the place stands up, so now you know where it came from. Speaking of big bangs, there was the theory behind Handel's royal fireworks music. The king had arranged for a big party with fireworks and music to celebrate with, but the special platform holding the fireworks caught fire and everything went off too early, and then it rained. After the smoke had cleared, 2 people were dead and hundreds injured. But the music was nice. It is nice music. By this time, Handel was old and extremely fat and losing his eyesight. His sight only got worse after surgery by John Taylor, who deserves a place in history for having ruined the eyes of the 2 greatest composers of the time period, Bach and Handel, and also of historian Edward Gibbon. Handel died on Good Friday in 1759 and was buried in Westminster Abbey among all the poets. You'd think with I really cannot read tonight. I'm so sorry, you guys. You'd think that with all the music he composed, someone would have had the sense to have some of it performed at his funeral. But the funeral music was composed by William Croft. Handel got his revenge later. No one listens to Croft nowadays. So that is the end of your first packet of reading. Your whole reading guide sheet comes from this reading. So if there's anything you missed or any places you want to fill back in, feel free to go back and watch some of this video again. Otherwise, it's all contained within the text you just read.